Okay, again, welcome. I'm Tatia Davenport, CASBO CEO, and I'm just really pleased to bring a conversation to the table today with Ken Kapphahn. We all know him well from the Legislative Analyst office, and we're going to dive into our budget here in the state in just a couple of moments. As we begin, I just want to let everyone know that we are recording the session, and we're going to ask that you put your questions in Q&A, not chat. So we're asking that you put your questions in the question and answer area so that if we don't get to something, we are able to track that back and make sure that we answer that for you in a little bit more structured format. So again, we are recording questions in the Q&A. So Ken, welcome. Thank you for being here and really engaging with us in this conversation. It's pretty vital around education and the challenges and approaches that we can look forward to ahead. Again, we always appreciate your time. I'm going to turn it right over to you to delve into our current status in the California budget. Ken?
Thanks. Thank you, Tasha, and good morning, everyone. Ken Kapphahn with the Legislative Analyst's Office. A few days ago, we released our first large report on the governor's budget, looking at the K-12 education package. This is Proposition 98 and K-12 education. And just to start right up front, this report has some sobering news. The overall message is that for both the legislature and for school leaders, is that some difficult decisions lie ahead, and that includes further reductions in funding relative to the levels that are in the governor's budget. A lot of that has to do with the revenue picture being worse than what the governor's budget anticipates. I think most school leaders know that the state delayed some tax payment deadlines last year. Those final payments came in much worse than the state anticipated, and that's driven a large deficit in the state budget. But what is not as well understood is that the governor's budget assumed a strong rebound from that lower level with pretty strong growth in income tax revenue in 23-24. And so far, that rebound has really failed to materialize. We just took a look at final personal income tax collections for January. They came in around $5 billion, or around 25% short of what the governor's budget had anticipated. And that's consistent with weakness in a number of key economic indicators that are important for state tax collections. So our best revenue estimates are that revenues, general fund revenues overall, are likely to come in just over $15 billion short of the governor's budget estimates in this fiscal year, and then another $8.4 billion short in the next fiscal year. So overall, down about $24 billion across the 2 years combined. That's important for schools because general fund revenue tends to be the most important input affecting the calculation of the Proposition 98 funding level for schools and community colleges. Under our estimates, that Proposition 98 pot of funding for schools is down $7.7 billion relative to the governor's budget estimate, a little over $5 billion of that reduction in the current year, and another $2.5 billion of that reduction in 24-25. One of the messages in this report is that the new spending for schools in this budget is starting to look increasingly unaffordable. The governor's budget had $1.4 billion in increases for school funding, largely for this cost of living adjustment and a second round of funding for zero-emission school buses. That's looking increasingly like commitments that the state isn't going to be able to maintain. One reason we say that it's unaffordable is that the governor's budget already relies on $2.7 billion in one-time funds to cover ongoing school and community college program costs in 24-25. And that's significant because that sets up a shortfall entering 25-26. So if we adopt the governor's budget, even if revenues were as good as the budget anticipates, the state would need to come up with $2.7 billion in funding just to maintain existing programs. That shortfall is going to be even larger under our revenue estimates, potentially something closer to $5 billion. We also have significant concerns with the what we call the funding maneuver, sometimes the cost shift, this new sort of accounting adjustment affecting $8 billion in school payments in the prior year. And we understand the intent of this is to avoid disruptive reductions to schools. But the way this works is that the state essentially takes $8 billion in payments to schools off its books, at least in 22-23, and then slowly recognizes the underlying budgetary cost of those payments over a 5-year period starting in 25-26. In effect, the state's using its cash resources to finance payments to schools that exceed the Proposition 98 funding requirement, and then creating an obligation to itself to eventually true up and recognize those costs. There's no change to those payments from a school perspective. The state's not going to recoup or offset those payments in the future. But this is very similar to really a kind of internal loan or some kind of internal borrowing where the state's creating a new obligation upon itself, but not to an outside creditor. We have some pretty significant concerns with that proposal. For one thing, it worsens the state's future deficit, which is already very large over the next couple of years. And it also decouples payments to schools with the state's recognition of the cost of those payments. And it does that for an extended period, and we're concerned by the precedent that would set. I think the bottom line message from our report is that the state is very likely going to need more spending solutions and reductions that affect K-12 schools by the time it enacts the budget. We think the legislature has an opportunity to make those reductions in ways that still preserve core programs and its highest priorities, things like the LCFF-based supplemental and concentration grants at their existing level, and also in a way that doesn't set up large future shortfalls either for the state budget overall or for school funding in the future. But taking that approach also is going to require some real reductions now. And part of this report is walking through the various options that the state has, recognizing that there are some tough decisions ahead. How can those be made in ways that are minimize the disruption for schools? And so maybe with that, I'll pause there and take questions.
Ken, one I know that's on everyone's mind are just walking through those recommendations. I think starting with that cost shift, what is the LAO's recommendation for how that $8 billion might be handled first? And then second, when we look at the reductions that you mentioned, kind of in what order and what recommendation do you have? And of course, for our entire audience, please enter questions into Q&A so that Ken can respond to those as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Our recommended alternative to the funding maneuver would be to use the Proposition 98 reserve to address that shortfall in 22-23. The governor's budget already has a discretionary reserve withdrawal, $5.7 billion across 23-24 and 24-25. Some of that is to support the new spending that would happen in 24-25. But typically the purpose of a reserve really is to maintain existing programs and to make withdrawals when the state would otherwise need to do something very disruptive. 22-23 seems like a very good example of that. We have this large, very unexpected shortfall. That seems like exactly what the Proposition 98 reserve was intended to address. And so we'd recommend using that to cover those costs in 22-23 instead of effectively accruing those costs to future years. As far as reductions that the state might make, one option, probably the starting point, would be to not adopt any of the spending increases that are in the governor's budget. So any of that $1.4 billion in new spending. But that, given the size of the reduction that we're talking about, that only gets us part of the way to a solution. Some of the other options that the state we think would want to look at, one we think would be rescinding unallocated grants. So we're talking in this case specifically about some of the competitive grants where the state is either not finished reviewing applications or not identified awardees. There's about $4.5 billion of unspent or unallocated grant funding. The state could pull back any of that doesn't represent its top priorities. The state might also be looking at programs where maybe there's a significant amount of carryover funding, and some of that funding could be used to temporarily support the underlying activities, and then the state would temporarily reduce the amount of state funding it provides. A third option could be looking at revisiting some recent program expansions. Over the past 2 or 3 years, the state has put a lot of ongoing funding into really 5, besides LCFF, into 5 other core program areas: the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, the school meals and universal school meals, state preschool, school transportation, and staffing ratios for transitional kindergarten. In all of those areas, there might be ways for the state to achieve its core objective, we think, but at a somewhat lower cost, potentially by changing some of the funding allocations as well as the specific requirements that are imposed on districts. And then lastly, under the governor's budget, the state still has nearly $3.9 billion in the Proposition 98 reserve that's available for future use. Under our revenue estimates, the state could be required to withdraw all of that remaining balance. And so that $3.9 billion, that could be used to help address some of the shortfall. Again, a reserve withdrawal obviously is only a one-time solution, but that could be very helpful in addressing some of the drop, particularly that the state is experiencing in the midst of this fiscal year.
And so, Ken, when we talk about the grants that could be eliminated, I just want to confirm the thoughts are that that might include universal meals. Is community schools involved in that, in those recommendations?
Yeah, so we actually have on page 17 of our report in figure 8, we actually have a specific breakdown of the grants that are involved. I think one thing that's important to emphasize is that these aren't the, districts are very familiar with essentially the mid-year reductions the state made to the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, as well as the Arts, Music, and Discretionary Instructional Materials Block Grant. Those aren't included in this option here. We recognize that those have been, reducing those were disruptive last year. They would probably be even more disruptive if the state were to do them now. So what we're really focused on are grants where the state hasn't yet dispersed the funding. The largest chunk of that is for the Community Schools Grant Program. Next largest is the funding for zero-emission school buses. A lot of the remainder are for training and professional development initiatives that the state has funded over the past couple of years.
Thank you, Ken. We've got a question around the report. Quote, given that the current Prop 98 funding level cannot support the cost of existing programs, we recommend rejecting the proposed COLA. Should the field interpret this as the LAO recommending COLA go to zero?
Yes, unfortunately, that the COLA, really any increases are looking unaffordable given the revenue estimates that we have. Obviously, this is not a recommendation made lightly, but it's also something where the state does fund COLA, it's going to have to do it by relying on one-time funds and setting up potentially an even larger problem next year.
That is sobering news, which brings us to that word that we really never want to hear, but is a reality: deferrals. Can we talk about that and your thoughts and anticipation of potentially having deferrals?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There are no deferrals proposed in the governor's budget, and deferrals obviously have a lot of downsides. For districts, of course, there's the disruption in cash flow, but even as a solution, deferrals really only provide one-time savings, and they can quickly cause a budget shortfall to snowball, because if you do a deferral in one year, the state is effectively counting on school funding to grow next year to make up for that. If school funding doesn't grow, it needs to not only maintain the deferral it did previously, but add to it. So there are many drawbacks to deferrals. Having said that, deferrals have been part of the state's solution to all of the previous significant downturns that it's faced. Certainly in the early 2000s, the state started with deferrals. It relied on them heavily during the Great Recession. It was the main solution during the COVID recession. So they have been something that the legislature has turned to in the past, I think partly because, well, deferrals have so many downsides. Sometimes the legislature and the governor have felt like they're the least bad option available. And so I think for districts, this is probably a good time just taking a hard look at your cash position, and what it would mean if the state were to delay some payments for a couple months next year. How reliant, every district obviously is reliant on state funding to a different extent. Districts have different levels of cash reserves, potentially different types of access to short-term borrowing. But I think this is a time to start thinking about what cash looks like and how districts would respond to a challenge to a deferral if that is something that emerges out of the final budget agreement.
And Ken, just from a timing standpoint, if we did see that come out of the final budget, when would we anticipate potentially that deferral?
Yeah, that's a very good question. My sense is that for 23-24, probably if there were any sort of deferral, it would only involve the more of an accounting change where the payment that normally comes at the end of June is instead scored to the beginning of July. That payment is anticipated to be very large this year, that final payment, and so the state wouldn't really need to defer anymore in the current year. For the upcoming year, that potentially could involve larger months. Again, or additional months. Again, it really depends on how many of the other solutions the legislature would choose to adopt. One positive, maybe a silver lining, is that the state's cash position, even though it faces a large budget shortfall, the state's cash position is still very strong. And so if the state did need to do a deferral, it would most likely do that starting from the very end of the fiscal year and only until July of the following fiscal year. Unlike in the Great Recession, where we did some deferrals from the beginning of the year, that had more to do with the state itself being in a very weak cash position. The state this time around is in a pretty strong cash position, and so those deferrals would, I think, start from the end of the year and work backwards from that point.
And I know we're asking a lot of crystal ball questions, but you've got such great insight. Thank you for entertaining some of these questions that I know are very future focused. We want to go back to COLA for a couple minutes. We have a question from the field. Would the unfunded COLA carry over like the old deficits? And then we have confirmation from another person in the field asking, the recommendation for 2024-25 budget is 0% COLA. So those are our two COLA questions on the table.
Yes. So yeah, again, that is our recommendation, no COLA. I think the state isn't able to afford it under our revenue estimates. There isn't under the law provision that automatically creates a deficit factor. I think we'd be a little bit maybe nervous about doing that because that might imply that a COLA is just around the corner. And under the revenue estimates that we have, it's not necessarily the case that the state, say when we get to 25-26, can expect to automatically make that up. The state has in the past done that. For example, we suspended the COLA in 2020 as part of our response to the big COVID downturn. We had a big dramatic economic turnaround the following year. The state restored the 2020 COLA and funded a 2021 COLA. If we are fortunate enough to experience a very strong kind of unexpected revenue rebound the next year, that could certainly be something the state would look at, but there isn't an automatic mechanism to do that at this point.
Thanks, Ken. I know one of the conversations I've heard in the field is a feeling that there's a lack of sort of transparency right now in, there's such a gap between the LAO, and I know that's closing, and certainly the Department of Finance. And I think there's a nervousness about the transparency, right? And so perhaps you have some thoughts on how you've mentioned certainly scenario planning, really getting your arms around the cash positions. What else can we be doing to feel a little bit more comfortable and confident as we go into the challenges ahead, given that there's, again, that really large gap and certainly a little lack of transparency that the field is feeling?
Yeah, I think part of that has a lot to do with communicating at the local level, and partly because this large shortfall isn't something that people are necessarily intuitively going to grasp. Some other measures of the economy, particularly at the national level, are still relatively strong. At the national level, we're still seeing economic growth. The US economy as a whole is looking resilient. Some of the concerns about a recession are ebbing away. So that picture sounds positive, and then yet we're also talking about the state facing a pretty severe revenue downturn. And so because that's counterintuitive, I think it is important to start having those conversations at the local level. And a lot of what this comes down to, I think, is that the economic indicators and metrics that are important for state revenue aren't necessarily the ones that matter for sort of typical, sort of, I guess, everyday life. Because our state revenue system does depend more on those higher income earners and corporations, and a lot of that, a lot of the sort of funding that flowed into business growth and expansion, some of that private capital, we're just not seeing that the way we did a couple of years ago. And so that's led to this big revenue shortfall, but it's not necessarily something that's intuitive. And so that's an important message. I think as far as the revenue estimates, I mean, we know that most likely the Department of Finance won't have a new update before the May revision, but they've got a smart economic team. They looked at the same data that we look at. And so I don't think we have, I think by the time we get to May, we'll see more of a convergence, particularly in the current year. By the time we get to May, the year will be less than 2 months from the end of the year. And so at that point, a lot of those collections will be in the books, and we'll have a better confirmation that the shortfall we saw in January is continuing through May and the end of the year.
It's a great example how two folks can look at the exact same data and have different interpretations. It's one that we face every day. We've got a question around the high income earners, and the question is, and I want to preface this by asking you to redefine or re-articulate, the big three and kind of what percent of revenues come in from personal income tax, our corporate, and our sales and use. So what does that sort of look like? Not necessarily the numbers, but sort of a percentage. And then we've got that really critical high income earner, in personal income tax. So could you walk us through just what, again, the general breakdown of the big three, and then the specific question is, do we see high income earners coming back past 24, 25?
Yeah, so I think many of you know that the big three are the state's three largest tax sources. About 2/3 in a typical year, about 2/3 of our state tax revenue comes from the personal income tax, and another third is divided about evenly between the sales tax and the corporation tax. Both the personal income tax and the corporation tax are very heavily weighted towards earners at the very high end of the scale. And if we look at sort of this weakness, I said there was personal income tax collections fell short $5 billion in January. If we break that down, most of that is attributable to the portion of the personal income tax that comes from estimated payments. Now, most Californians don't make estimated payments. These are payments that are made by individuals who have significant earnings from capital gains, other types of non-wage income, and that's really where the bulk of the revenue shortfall was concentrated. About $4 billion of that $5 billion shortfall was from lower than anticipated payments from those folks, and only about $1 billion of the shortfall was related to regular income tax withholding. The sort of volatility, the concern about our folks leaving California, I mean, that's something we obviously watch closely, but the sort of volatility we think we've seen the past couple of years isn't really directly related to that. We've really seen, obviously, a very big drop in revenue following the start of the pandemic, a surge in 2021 and continuing into 2022. Now we're back to a much weaker revenue environment again. So that's not folks rapidly moving in and out of the state that's causing that. But we are still watching that more as a long-term issue and seeing how taxpayers react to that.
And are we attributing that to the markets and investments? If it's not in and out of state, is that where we're pointing?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. This is something we've asked ourselves many times because the original drop that we saw in 22-23 wasn't something we had anticipated either. And I think a big part of the story ultimately is that our state economy was even more sensitive to interest rate changes and federal monetary policy than we had anticipated previously. We've really seen over the past year a pretty big reduction in kind of funding available for business startup and expansion. Venture capital is down. Fewer California companies are going public. So a lot of the sort of money that was flowing there and generating a lot of state tax revenue remains depressed, and it's not happening. And so that's important for the state because those kinds of events, like an initial public offering, for example, generate a lot of state tax revenue, and we haven't seen those return. And so we're still, I think, still looking at all of the different factors in play, but the sensitivity of the state economy to interest rates and the higher interest rates that we've seen seems to be one pretty significant factor.
Thank you. We've got a question. Considering the ESSER funding will still be flowing through September of 2024, and recent info from the street that inflation will end the year around 2.5%, would you have a 2 and 3 year outlook for COLA?
You know, the last time we did this in December, our estimates of COLA beyond after 24-25 were right around 3% a year each year for the next few years. I will say candidly that the multi-year COLA estimates haven't been great. The COLA has been hard to predict. And as an example of that, I think last May, the estimated COLA rate from the Department of Finance was around 4% for 24-25. Now it's closer to 1%. And so the COLA estimates for the upcoming year, our office in the Department of Finance, I think, have tended to be close on those. But for beyond really the immediate year, there's been a lot of volatility in that COLA rate. Again, though, our best estimate back in December was really the historical average of about 3%. For the 2 years following the budget year.
And so relating to the scenario planning that our districts are doing, the sort of 3 levels, worst case, and so forth, what would you suggest we're using, at least in these initial scenario plans?
A lot of that will come down to, I think, what the state ultimately does with 24-25, because if the state does ultimately decide to fund a COLA in 24-25, it might be able to make that work with one-time funds, but that's just going to make it even harder to fund the COLA and existing LCFF program costs in the following years. So I guess given that the state, under the governor's budget, already has about a $2.7 billion shortfall set up for 25-26, I'd probably think of the 3% COLA as more like an upper bound on what the state might be able to fund. And I'd be looking at some possibilities where even if the statutory COLA is closer to 3%, the state isn't in the position where it can fund that rate each year in 25-26 and 26-27.
Ken, as I'm out across the state, I heard both superintendents and CBOs saying they really feel like they're out there on their own trying to signal to their communities the budget challenges and having to kind of fight that alone when there really is this much larger, obviously statewide issue. Has there been a time that the state kind of comes out and carries this message for our districts so that our leaders are not left alone to be making these announcements and it seemingly is at a local level when really we have a very large state challenge ahead? What have you seen take place on that, and what might be your recommendations around that type of scenario?
Yeah, we sure hope so. One of the sort of messages we've had for the legislature about making tough decisions is that they the longer the state waits to make them and the longer it waits to signal to districts that it's going to make them, the more difficult they are, both up here at the state level and maybe even more so at the local level. Our hope is that this report that we've released will start that conversation. We have next week, we'll have the first education budget subcommittee hearings, both the Senate and the Assembly. Well, we'll be hearing from our office and the Department of Finance. We'll be sharing these recommendations and these findings and the economic message with the legislature. And I think one of the important messages that we'll have for them is that the sooner the state squares up to this difficult situation, communicates about it, signals how it's going to address it, the easier it's going to be to deal with the shortfall. Again, that's not to say it's going to be easy, but this is one of those challenges where it's if we wait until the May revision and we sort of have, if we're waiting until we have sort of complete consensus between, say, our office and the Department of Finance, we'll be very close to the start of the year. And so it makes more sense, I think, to acknowledge that now, and for the legislature to use the upcoming hearings to sift through all of the options and start signaling about the kinds of reductions it might be interested in pursuing and how it sees the trade-offs.
We agree. The more transparent that we as a state can be around the situation, it really takes then the superintendent and the CBO out of that crossfire at the local level, and gets us all sort of hand in hand, like we're all facing this together versus this perception that it might be just a local issue. So thank you for your guidance on that. Are there any questions that we would like to pose to Ken in our remaining time? Well, looking like we don't have any further questions. Ken, I want to thank you always for your transparency and just sharing this information with us up front so that we can appropriately respond in our own districts and communities. And thank you for being a wonderful partner to CASBO. We look forward to our next steps together as we face the challenges in the budget ahead. And we know that you're going to be a partner right there walking with us. So, oh, there's one more. What would Ken say are the most salient points we should walk away with?
Yeah, I think, really starting with upfront is that the state is facing a larger budget shortfall and lower revenues than what was anticipated in the governor's budget. And we may not know exactly how that's going to translate to schools until the legislature and the governor get together and talk about their solution. And obviously that's challenging for districts that are trying to plan and thinking about where are the reductions and where might they fall. And if there's not a budget agreement until June, that's obviously challenging. But I think the important part is realizing now that the state is in a worse fiscal position. The revenue recovery that we're anticipating hasn't happened, and that is likely going to affect districts in some way. And whether that's going to be not providing a COLA, other types of reductions, deferrals, lots of things could be in the mix. But it is time, I think, to start looking at some of those more pessimistic scenarios that are worse than the governor's budget, and thinking about how that's going to affect districts.
Is the state planning to recall ELOP funds that have been apportioned?
There's nothing like that in the governor's proposal. Potentially, the state could think about maybe asking districts to use some of those funds to support ELOP programs, say next year on a temporary basis if they have carryover funding. But at this point, there's nothing in the governor's budget, and the legislature, at least so far, hasn't signaled that that's one of the things it's looking at. We should have a better sense, I think, as the hearings get going. They'll hear an update on the ELOP dollars, and we might have a better sense at that point how much they're looking at that as a possible solution.
Looks like we've got a flood of questions coming in, and I can't help but think about the conversation we're having and the fact that we've got 20 120 new bills coming in, right? Where folks are like, let's spend some money. I love one of our officers, Eric Dill, always said, no matter what conversation you think you're having in education, it is about money. And we've got 2,124 new conversations, not all education based. All right, so we have another question. The state's January revenue was down 6.7 billion. Are there any preliminary insights for February?
Still don't have the final February collections, but at this point, nothing we've seen so far is suggesting that we're seeing the kind of sharp rebound that I think the governor's budget was built upon. So we're hoping to have, I think, kind of an updated post on our website after a few days after the end of the month. But at this point, we're not seeing things in the data that change our assessment.
All right, Ken, again, thank you. I appreciate the signal of just the candidness, the scenario planning, the attention that we need to put on this, the early communication and warnings for our communities and board. Thank you for bringing this to the table, being with us today. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. We know it's a tough year ahead. We're looking forward to the conversations with districts and chief business officials and all of the local leaders. And we will do our best to keep you informed, both through conversations like these, as well as the additional information we'll be releasing on our website and the economic updates in the coming months.
As always, thank you. Have a great day.